Alrighty, we seem to be underway and recording. So for those of you watching at home, welcome to week 6 of animal law. This week we talk about the legal research in the animal law context. So as I'm sure you're probably aware, you've got a research paper due sort of next month, and that will be an opportunity for you to choose a topic that, within reason, you've got a lot of flexibility in the topic that you choose, and conduct a bit of your own research into that space and hopefully do something that really interests you. So today we're going to have a bit of a discussion about the kinds of things that you might find useful to think about while you undertake that project, and think about some of the considerations that you're going to have to make, and in that context it's worth thinking that it is only 2,000 words, so it's not a whole lot of space, it's not a whole lot of time, and so it is really important that you think about picking a topic that is going to be feasible for you to do in the time frame. So that's what I would suggest to you, and I know some of you have had conversations about your topics with Alex already, is you'll find the task much easier if you pick or if you try and narrow your focus, right? It's really easy to think about, I want to do something really general or really broad, but the trap that you'll fall into is you'll either for one, you'll go well over the word count, which will be a problem, or you will end up talking about a whole range of things at a very superficial level, when in fact it's better to talk about one or two things in a lot of detail and with a lot of thought and research and critical analysis. So really working quite hard on picking something quite specific, and really narrowing your question, your research question, that's going to be something that's really important and really key. So that's a first bit of advice, I suppose, and I'm more than happy over the next few weeks, as you progress towards completing this assignment, for you to get in touch with whatever topic you're thinking about, and we can workshop that, and we can think about how do you narrow it further, how do you refine the scope and things like that. So you don't have to do that all alone. Obviously it has to be your research question, but it's I'm on hand to help with that process, and some of the activities that we've got today will be sort of geared towards that as well. So I suppose point one being, develop a really targeted, interesting, right? You get freedom with this task, so you may as well take advantage of that. So pick a question that's interesting to you, is specific or targeted, and so that will empower you to do something really detailed and analytical, which will be really good. The other thing to think about is, once you've got your question, or alongside that question, think about what sort of research you're going to conduct, and how you're going to go about it. So I think your task sheet talks about maybe you do a case study, maybe you'll do some sort of comparative piece, so either international comparison or comparison between states or something like that, or you can do, you've got other options as well, but though they're maybe a little bit more involved. In this space we sometimes think about surveys or interviews and things like that. I would suggest in the time frame that's probably not going to be feasible, But it's worth thinking about the types of research methods that people use in this space, definitely. So I suppose, we've got plenty of things that we can think about and discuss in relation to research, and there's a few activities and things that we'll be able to work through today. But before we do get underway with any of that, I think it would be useful to open the discussion up and just have either an extended or a brief chat about what you think of research and animal law research, and whether there are any sort of broad questions or concerns that you have about conducting your own research in this space. Yeah, of course. It's a good question. It's one that is very contextual, right? And if you haven't already, I'm sure you'll come across people who have very strong opinions about, you shouldn't cite anything that's older than 10 years or or 5 years or whatever. I'm not of that strong an opinion, but I think it is important. It's definitely important to think about the time in which whatever you're referring to was researched or written. Obviously, where it refers to particular legislation or case law that has since moved on or progressed, obviously that's going to be of limited value. But stuff that's more dated, for one, might be the only thing that's available, or for two, might be directly relevant to your particular research question. So, for example, one of the kind of research papers that you've been looking at over the past few weeks, thinking about kind of Australians' understandings of and attitudes towards this idea of animals as property, right? They kind of make the case that this seems to be a developing or a changing sort of societal landscape, in that people are increasingly aware of or opinion is changing about the treatment of animals. And with that kind of research, referring to something from 50 years ago might be very useful and very relevant, because you can say, look, the last time that anything like this was done was 50 years ago, and this is what the study found. Now there have been all these developments, there have been all these societal changes. We would expect that Australians' attitudes and values in this space would also have changed, or something like that. So yeah, I'm not going to say there's a cut-off date that you can't refer to anything beyond or anything like that, but I do think that it is something that does need to be paid attention to, and does need to be you need to have there needs to be a reason to refer to a particular source and think about the context in which that research was conducted, and whether that context is still relevant now. But great question. Any other sort of big or broader initial thoughts? Yeah, of course. Okay. Yep. Yeah, that's fine. The I suppose a lot of the doctrinal stuff that we look at in this unit is focused on Queensland, just because we have to pick somewhere to focus on, and being CQU, we picked Queensland. But yeah, for your research paper, you can sort of um, stray away from that, and yeah, definitely looking at New South Wales is that's fine. Um, it might be useful to, and it doesn't have to be long or detailed by any means, but it might be useful to provide even a little justification about why New South Wales, and that can be a reference to the fact that there have been some interesting recent developments there. It can be that um, there are more Brumbies in New South Wales than elsewhere in Australia or something. So it's the exact reason doesn't really, it matters, but can be any number of things. But providing some kind of justification for why New South Wales is interesting and useful, um, is a good idea too, even if it's just a couple of sentences in the introduction or something. But yeah, perfectly happy for you to look at New South Wales for that research paper. That's all right. Um, yep. hmm Not only are you allowed to, I would probably recommend it from the perspective of developing a narrowly focused um, research question. You know, the things that are listed in the research, in a task sheet, are just some kind of broad ideas to kind of kickstart your thinking. I would certainly pick one of those bullet points to you know as a starting point, but they're in themselves generally too broad to sustain a research paper that is going to be you know um, sufficiently detailed and analytical. So yeah, definitely, and the same thing applies in terms of when you're doing case studies or international comparisons. Thinking about why you're picking that as a particular focus of study, and again, it doesn't have to be detailed, but just some explanation for why it's worthwhile knowing about you know um, use of animals in laboratories in China, or whatever, is always useful and relevant and important too. But yeah, definitely um, use those bullet points and narrow down from there. Excellent. Alrighty. Well, shall we keep rolling with any other broad-based questions, if there are any? Alrighty. I'll take that as a no. Feel free as we go through. Feel free as we go through to interrupt me and ask questions as we go through. This is really designed to be quite a free-flowing discussion, and that's why there's a whole 2 hours allocated tonight. But with that in mind, what we might start doing now is working through some of the tutorial activities. And the first one, I'm sort of going to jump around them a little bit to sort of work towards a few broader research ideas. So the first one that we're going to look at is the international comparison in the animal index. And so I believe that this is a revisiting from a previous week, but we're kind of taking a little bit of a different focus tonight and thinking about things from a more research-oriented perspective. But what I thought you might do is I'll just get, I suppose, a grab bag of responses, thinking about which countries people chose for their international comparisons, a brief summary of which indicator you chose, and what you found. So does anyone want to kickstart us on that one? So in the chat we've got Kat saying that the Australian Commonwealth... Sorry, Kat, I missed your question in the chat as well. So I'll address that one first. Can we make recommendations as to changes to statutes within our paper? You can. I would be cautious about it dominating the paper, in the sense that this is a research task rather than necessarily a policy task. So certainly, in your discussion and analysis, you can point to particular elements of statutes that aren't working particularly well, and you can point to other research that suggests that a different approach might work better, or particular reforms might be useful. But I would recommend that be fairly tightly contained and also supported by research. That's not to say that you can't have original ideas too, and in fact, original ideas in this space can be really good, but making sure that the paper really kind of meets the task description of a research paper is really important too. And now I'll move on to the international comparisons. So the Australian Commonwealth is recommended to have amendments to the Constitution to represent animal welfare and define sentient, and we can compare that with Mexico, which is recommended to follow the example of the Federal District of Michoacan de Ocampo, sentient and welfare considerations, and Vietnam, same as Mexico. So broadly, as I understand that comparison, some broadly similar findings around a lack of definition of what animal sentience is, and beyond that a desire to have that more firmly embedded within the legal framework, perhaps in the Constitution. So that's an interesting idea. So thinking about this issue of animal sentience, that's really good. I'll gather a few more comparisons and then we'll think about okay, cool. I was going to follow that up with, so Mexico was rated at C, Vietnam F, and Australia D. So Mexico more advanced in this space, but still with some way to go. Australia and Vietnam really lagging. Okay, that's interesting. That's good. We'll work with that. I'll get a few more comparisons, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion about some of the research implications for this stuff. So does someone else want to have a go? Hi. Yep, yep. Okay. Yeah, no, I can hear you. Okay. Yep. Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay. We will. Cool. Alrighty, we can work with that as well. Excellent. Alrighty. Another one. Alrighty, we can work with two for now. That's fine, and then we can build in a third or a fourth if anyone wants to jump in later on as well. So, okay, so two really interesting sort of key issues here. One, looking at sort of the concept of sentience and how that's treated, and then um, welfare of animals in relation to farming, but also a really interesting follow up around I suppose broader um, capacity for legislation, um, you know, between a you know all things considered stable country and one that has enjoyed far less stability in recent years. So that's really cool too. Um, if I can ask a follow up question to Kat and Steph, that's more, I suppose, researchy. How did you decide which countries you were going to compare with Australia? Okay. Yep. Yeah. No, and that's fair enough. This wasn't a task that necessarily required any rigorous method. So that's perfectly fine. So yeah, dartboard. That's cool. How about you, Steph? Hmm. Okay. Yep. So interest and a level of personal experience or connection as well. Um, cool. Okay. So the reason I ask is because when we think about research, and especially if you're thinking about a research topic that has some kind of comparative element, so perhaps it's an international comparison between different countries, perhaps it's a comparison of Queensland and Victorian policy or something like that. It's useful to think about the cases that you are, or I say cases as in the sort of social scientific meaning rather than the legal you know case. I should say I should say maybe focus, um, unit of focus instead, or something. Um, when you're doing a comparative analysis, the examples that you pick are necessarily going to impact your finding, right? If you compared Australia and the UK on something, you probably reach a very different conclusion than you would comparing Australia and somewhere like Myanmar or Vietnam. There's very different legal structures, very different histories, many different sort of cultural values and things like that as well. And those are all relevant to whatever kind of comparative analysis that you choose. So if you are thinking about doing some kind of comparative research for this assessment, and that can be a really great thing to do, right? It's the kind of research that, as long as you've got your topic fairly well straightened out, the research can flow quite easily. A lot of the analysis as well is kind of pretty intuitive, because you just look at the things that are similar, look at the things that are different, and think about why that might be the case. So a comparative research paper can be a very powerful one if you were sort of a bit lost for what you might do. But if you do choose to go down that road, I would really strongly encourage you to think about which cases you're choosing, and why you're choosing that particular comparison. And you might, there can be any number of reasons to choose a particular comparison, and it's not necessarily problematic to choose one approach versus another, but being able to clearly explain why you chose those particular cases is something that's really, really useful and really important in thinking about the analysis that is going to follow as well, right? Being able to explain, and I'm not having a go, Kat, because as I said, that wasn't the brief for the tutorial question, but just throwing, choosing comparisons from the dartboard is not going to, it's not academically very rigorous, even though it's fine for a tutorial. Being able to sort of explain, I chose Australia and Canada because they're both federal systems of government. Both have a colonial connection to the UK. Both have very geographically dispersed populations, and so they're kind of quite similar, and therefore where there are differences in a particular outcome or particular legislation, it's really interesting to understand why those differences arise, and Australia might be able to learn something from Canada because of that, or vice versa. So thinking about what you're going to choose for the comparison is really important. Great question in the chat from Rachel. Do we need to include that in the paper, and if so, where? Yes. And the reason why it's important to include that kind of consideration or discussion is because, as I say, it will influence the your conclusions or your analysis, right? As I said, if you're comparing two countries that are fairly similar, and then you find that they have similar approaches to animal sentience, or they have similar problems in their animal welfare framework, you kind of go, okay, well, they're quite similar countries, they've got similar laws, so cool, that's all you've got to show, kind of thing. Whereas if you can show that there are similarities in the countries themselves, but vast differences in the way that they approach a particular issue, then that's really interesting, and maybe there's something we can learn from that, and the analysis itself becomes much richer. The opposite, if you choose two countries that are very different, but have somehow got quite similar approaches to a particular issue, or have taken a very similar philosophical position on the recognition or the status of animals in society, despite vastly different cultures or something, then that might be really interesting too, because it's like, okay, these are two very different cultures, but they've got a similar kind of philosophical approach. That's really cool. That's really interesting. Why is that the case? So being able to explain and justify why you've picked the countries that you have adds to the richness of the analysis that you're going to be conducting. So, and as I said, this is only if you're doing comparative research. You don't have to do that kind of a topic. But if you are, then it makes sense to include some kind of description, discussion, defense of why you've picked the countries that you have. I would say that there should be at least some consideration of it in your introduction. Maybe a little bit, and it can be the kind of thing that gets scattered throughout, right? So addressing, at least at a very basic level in the introduction, the different countries and why they've been chosen, then thinking through kind of the background section. You might be thinking about some of the broader backgrounds to the two countries or the two jurisdictions, and why that's relevant, and then in the analysis really opening up and discussing why those particular things arise. So do we need to compare other countries in our assessment? No. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. You don't have to do an international comparison, and you don't have to do a comparative piece at all necessarily. The reason I'm sort of thinking about this, so one of the topics talks about animals and international law, and so that potentially opens up an international comparison. And then you've got some of the other topics that are more, I suppose, doctrinal and look at particular elements of, regulation of animals and animal protection frameworks. And so those as well potentially lend themselves to research topics that are comparative in nature. But absolutely, you don't have to do a comparative piece. And yeah, I should really stress that. That's just one approach that you can take, and it can be, a really powerful one. As I've said, it can open up a lot of really interesting things to talk about. But yeah, it definitely doesn't have to be comparative at all. Any other questions on that? Cool. So the so as I said, it's the sort of the topics that are listed in the task sheet are I suppose initial starting points for you to develop a more detailed research questions. So those are you need to pick something that at least has some connection to the content from the first 5 weeks, but within that they're fairly broad topics. There's a lot of scope to really branch out and pick something that is really interesting to you. The other, I think, useful, really important, really useful tutorial activity that's listed for this week is the task that's looking at So there's the 3 research papers, which I understand you've looked at in previous weeks as well. But this time around, we're going to look at some really core research-oriented questions. So thinking about, what does an abstract do, and what's the role, how's it been used, why did this piece of research get conducted, why, what was the research question, and what methodology or approach did the authors use to address that research question. So my understanding is that you pick 2 of the 3. So hopefully across the range of people in this tutorial, we cover all 3. So we might sort of start with, if anyone wants to kind of, I suppose, volunteer to go first, talking about one of the research papers that were listed, and we can kind of go from there, thinking about what the research aimed to achieve, and kind of how it went about doing that, and what lessons we can take from that for our own animal law research. So would anyone like to kick us off by picking one of those 3 papers that were listed? Maybe if I kind of jump in and think about the Shyam reading. So is the classification of animals as property consistent with modern community attitudes? What was going on with that one? Did anyone pay particular attention to that research paper? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, cool. Yep, that's a really great start. So really noticing the abolitionist debate as being sort of an interesting development in the space, and then thinking about this whole idea of conceptualizing animals as property, and whether that's sort of consistent with community standards. Okay, yep, that's cool. Did anyone else have a look at that research paper? Yep, Michael says that he did in the chat. So did you pick up similar things, or did you did something different leap out to you as you read through that paper? That's all right. Yes, yeah, I can hear. Yep, absolutely. Yep, cool. Um, adding in this idea, or starting to think more closely about this kind of the public attitudes or the public value angle, and then layering on top of that this idea about, okay, people, certainly have opinions and values and ideas about animals, but how founded are those values in are those values how well are those values founded in an understanding of the legal framework and the implications that arise from that. Yeah, really cool. Alrighty, that's those are some good points. Does anyone else want to add in any other ideas or things that they really thought about while reading through this paper? In the chat, Rachel found it quite biased around property or abolishing animal use. She only mentioned other options in one area. So, yeah, sort of focusing on perhaps extreme ends of the debate and not really, not necessarily giving respondents to the survey a whole range of options. I think that's a really great point for a few reasons, but I'll I don't want to hog the discussion, so I'll circle back to those in a minute and open the floor back up to other people, or if you wanted to elaborate further, Rachel. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, really good points. Yeah, I've got a few comments on that, but I think it's a great pickup. I'll circle back to it, and but in the meantime, I'll let other people weigh in if they want to on that first paper. Did other people find it biased? I suppose the key things, the key reasons why I think it's sort of interesting to make those observations is that it's, for one, when you're thinking about doing your own research paper, and in terms of thinking about what's feasible, I would suggest that doing a survey in the next couple of weeks over the Christmas period and writing a research paper is not going to be feasible, most likely. So learning lessons from the paper that draws on a survey, there's limited values there, but there's still, I think, a broader lesson around I suppose being quite using your research to inform the way you go about writing your paper and crafting your arguments. And that's, of course, that's not to say that you can't have a particular perspective on an issue, or argue for a particular point of view. But what's important is that that view is supported by quality, rigorous academic research, right? And so we might, we might think about the way that the author presents the argument or the debate as being between, animals are either viewed as property, or we completely abolish the whole idea of humans using animals and minimizing all the space in between. And then, the way that influenced the questions that were put to respondents, and then the way that influenced the results and the discussion that followed. I think there's a useful lesson there in terms of, certainly have an opinion, certainly, be support that position with academic research, but also recognize that there's another side potentially to that position, and being, I suppose, fair to that other side. Obviously you don't have to agree with them, but representing the counter arguments in a way that is also accurate and reflects the academic research. And in fact, when you do that, you come up with a stronger argument for your own position, because you are fairly representing the other side and then presenting arguments that counter that other perspective, and undermine it on its merit, rather than some kind of straw man equivalent of what, or approximation of what the counter argument is. So being certainly have an opinion, certainly have a perspective, but being fair in the way that you present that in your paper is a valuable lesson to learn there as well. The other thing that is useful, and as I said, I'm not suggesting that you go out and do surveys necessarily, but potentially you will draw on, in your research, you'll draw on other papers that have conducted surveys. Maybe you'll even draw on this one. Thinking about some of the limitations of that survey methodology is important as well, right? Sort of thinking about reading sources critically, not just taking things at face value, not just taking things that, oh, well, they did a survey, so it must be right or accurate or whatever. Digging a little deeper and thinking about, okay, who was asked, and in particular with this study, the author quite clearly acknowledges that it's a very limited study, in the sense that they just asked people who happened to be waiting for the train or waiting for the bus in Melbourne and regional Victoria. And so the extent to that's a fair sample of, even Victoria, let alone, the whole of Australia is quite limited. And, the author's quite upfront about that, but it's still a limitation. So who was asked, what were they asked as well, and thinking about, the way that questions are worded, the way options are presented, as Rachel sort of mentioned, whether all the possible options are captured. These are important things to be thinking about in the way that you conduct your own research for the purposes of applying that to your own paper, right? So say you were doing a research topic that was also connected to Australians' ideas of animals or as property, and let's say that you wanted to argue for a framework that is much more in sort of in line with that sort of trustee stewardship kind of position. You might refer to this study and critique it and say, look, the author found X, but that survey was limited because it was just a sample of convenience. It was only a small number of people, and therefore we should only put a low weight on it. And then maybe you find another survey that's been done that maybe is a little bit more rigorous, and you can rely on that more heavily as well instead. And so, I think that there's some really great lessons to be taken from this study in terms of thinking critically about the method that has been adopted, and in particular, in this instance, we're thinking about survey research. And while I would be the last person to knock survey research, I do a lot of it myself, but being careful about how it's conducted and recognizing its limitations is really important as well. And that's you can use that in your own critical reading and in your research. In the chat, Michael's added, I agree, may have to some extent invalidated the purpose of the survey if respondents didn't have a full understanding of what the legal status of property entailed. Right, so there's, from a methodological perspective, there's a difference between, asking someone a bunch of questions that they only kind of half understand versus, if even if people had been asked, okay, do you think of animals as property, yes or no, and then just a very quick information summary. Okay, under Australia's legal framework, property is defined as this, and it has these implications. Now that you know a little bit more, do you still think of animals as property, or do you have a different perspective now? Even something like that, potentially really radically alters the results, and also, maybe perhaps gives a better indication, allows for a more accurate conclusion in relation to, the utility of education in this space, which was one of the author's kind of points as well. So yeah, really thinking about critically reading your research, not just taking everything at face value, is really useful and really important as well. To, I suppose, tie this back to some of the questions that are presented in your study guide, we've touched on a lot of this already, but what would you say was the key research question then for this particular paper? What did the author really want to try and get at? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's probably a good summary. I sort of, on along similar lines, I sort of thought that the research question was probably, do Australians understand animals as property, and do they agree with that sort of status? Perhaps an even more accurate statement would be, do Victorians understand animals as property and agree with that and what that means? And maybe an even more narrow, accurate definition of the research question would be, do almost 300 people in Melbourne and regional Victorian train stations, blah 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 blah. So and that's a bit extreme. But the reason I say it like that is because that really highlights for you guys how important it is to come up with a research question that is really, really tightly focused, and the narrower you can make it, the more powerful your research paper will be, right? Because that having that clear, tight research question will drive your research and really provide a useful guide for finding accurate sources and everything else. So the extent to which you can narrow that question down is going to be really important. Comments in the chat: do urban Australians? My understanding is that there were some, and my Victorian geography is not the best. My understanding was that Gippsland was, a little bit out. Certainly not Melbourne. So, but I think it's a fair point that there are potentially differing values between people living in metropolitan areas versus people living in regional Australia, and to the extent that influences an overall perception of Australians' attitudes towards animals in this space, that's an important part of the methodology as well. Absolutely. And so in terms of thinking about, okay, what methods did the author use? Obviously, we're thinking about a survey. And so that comes with a bunch of strengths and limitations as well. As I've been a bit critical of the method in the sense that, I've said that it's a very small sample, it's convenience sampled, and that doesn't necessarily present a very fair representation of anywhere. But asking 300 people is, also a hell of a lot better than just going down the corridor at university and asking the 5 academics down the corridor from you, right? Like it's she could have done a lot worse in terms of survey methodology. So there's a strength to be had there, but some limitations as well. So perceptions as well, perhaps differing based on people's situation, whether they the kinds of animals that they own or interact with regularly as well. And I think there was some consideration in the paper given to those kinds of questions. We can certainly critique whether enough consideration was given to those kinds of issues, but there was at least an acknowledgement and an attempt to differentiate between some of those questions as well, which was really interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. As I suppose a more broad research, and the reason I bring this up is because I noticed as I was reading this article that it was written by a PhD candidate. From a research perspective, obviously, your key sources are going to be peer-reviewed journal articles, as that's the kind of gold standard for academic research. But then things like books, conference papers, those sorts of things are certainly good to draw on as well. And then you can draw on other things too, but those are the really key things. But as a sort of a research tip, if you can find recent PhD theses, which are usually available freely online as well on various university databases, invariably you will find that just the very nature of a PhD process means that someone has to spend at least a year really just reading and reading and reading and going through. So if you can find a recent PhD thesis that's at least related to whatever topic you're choosing, there's a good chance that that will be a real treasure trove of resources and will point you to other sources that are quite up to date and that will be really relevant as well. So that's a little research tip, and as I said, I thought of it because I noticed that this paper was written by a PhD candidate. So it's a fair assumption to say that the author is really up to date with this stuff. That's not to say, of course, that other articles published in journals and stuff aren't up to date too. Of course they have to be, but if you can find a good PhD thesis on a topic that's at least somewhat related to whatever you're interested in, there will be a really detailed literature review that will point to a lot of that kind of will do a lot of the groundwork for you as well. So that's a little tangential tip, I suppose. Shall we move on to one of the other research papers? Maybe what's the next one? Morton and others, the uniformity of Australian protection law, which was a comparison of Australian states. Did anyone spend any time with this research paper? I think the thing that's interesting and useful with this paper, and to some extent, so for one, it's explicitly a comparative piece in the sense that they're comparing laws across the different Australian jurisdictions. In that regard, it's bigger in scope than what you will be doing in your research. Right, I wouldn't suggest that you compare all Australian states for your research topics. Maybe if the area or the topic that you were looking at was really niche, you might be able to. But if you're wanting to do something comparative, I would say that probably just picking two jurisdictions to compare is probably going to be easier. But nevertheless, it's a comparative piece, and so you can see some of the ways that the authors compare and contrast, and raise how things are similar or different, and the way that's interesting. So it's a useful example in that regard. The other thing that's I think quite useful as well is the way that the authors sort of set the parameters for their study. So they did a systematic literature review, which is a fairly involved process, but is nevertheless a useful one. But they were very clear in their parameters in saying up front, okay, we're going to look at we're only looking at statutes, and so we're not looking at repealed legislation, we're not looking at bills in progress, etc., etc. So they were very upfront about saying we're looking at this particular thing, and we're not going to look at these other things. And I think that there's a really useful lesson there for your own research, because it, as I said, it's really important that you develop a really tight, quite narrow focus on a particular topic or issue or question. And of course, the more you drill down onto something, the more things that kind of get excluded along the way, and that is a natural part of research, and it's something that you have to do. I mentioned at the start that I've sort of put together this research paper with Alex, and I don't want to talk gratuitously about that. But one of the really interesting things that we found was the narrowing down on the particular topic that we chose. Certainly along the way we found other things that were really interesting and really cool. Oh, what about this? What about this? But you can't fit everything into a research paper. You've got to be really tightly focused, and so we had to be really disciplined and say to ourselves, no, that's really cool, but maybe that's for another time, maybe that's for a different paper. No, we're sticking to this. And it would have been a similar process for these authors, being really clear about what's included and therefore what's excluded. And what I'm saying to you guys is that that's completely fine for your own research papers as well. By being very focused about what you're going to include, of course there are going to be things that you have to exclude, and that's fine. That's, as I said, you kind of have to do that. What's important is that you are, fairly clear and explicit about what's being excluded and what's being included. And so, if there is something that you are really interested in, and that kind of raises some logical connections to other things that you're simply not going to have the space to look at, just be very upfront and say, I'm looking at rabbits. Guinea pigs are a related area, but it's beyond the scope of this paper. And then maybe in the conclusion you kind of can mention, there's these other interesting aspects about guinea pigs, but the key focus has been rabbits or something like that. So, being clear about, just as clear about what's being excluded as what's being included is important too. And I think that that's something that this paper handles really well, is it is very clear about defining. We only looked at statute. These were the other things that we excluded. This is the implications of that decision, and away we go, kind of thing. So that's a useful lesson from that paper as well. In terms of more so the content and the findings, did anyone have any interesting ideas or reactions to that, to what the authors found? That's cool. I'll take that one as a no. We might move on to the final paper, which was the free range paper, which I thought was pretty interesting. Anyone want to give an initial take or reaction to that one? Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Yeah. So actually thinking about the I suppose, structural elements of the paper you found really useful. That's a great takeaway to have too. And then you mentioned the dual aspects of, there's the kind of the free range egg debate, and then there's also this broader tension around how is policy created, and how does industry in particular, but how do, I suppose, activists in this space more broadly influence government policy, especially in an animal law context. And I think that's a really great observation, because it highlights something that is also quite useful for your own research papers, in that I'd suggest that the key research question for this paper, or for the authors, is the latter. So really what they're interested in is government policy making, and the way that industry, in this case, supermarkets and chicken farmers, the influence and the power, and they talk about the cozy relationship with government, and the implications that has on animal welfare regulation and animal protection in this space. That was, I'd suggest that that's probably their broader interest, and what they've done is they've picked up on this kind of free range egg debate as a really good example, and from a research perspective, what you'd refer to as a case study of the way that policy is made, and the way that activists influence policy. And that can be another really useful way of constructing your own research paper, right? It might be that you've got a particular interest in something, and it might not inherently necessarily be itself animal law related, but then you find a particular issue within animal law that is really relevant, and you can use as a case study to really unpack in some detail and run with, really look at what's gone on, how the events unfolded, who said what. It depends on what the example is, obviously, but picking a key moment, event, piece of legislation, whatever it is, and using that to really highlight a broader discussion or debate or key issue that you're interested in. And so, my understanding in a previous week is that you guys sort of talked about transparency in maybe in slaughterhouses, I think it was, and it's possible that kind of thing can quite easily be framed as you start with a targeted research question around government or transparency and accountability in private business, and then the specific case study of abattoirs or whatever becomes the key driving example that you use and analyze throughout the research paper. So this is in itself a really, really interesting piece of research, but I think it also potentially highlights for you guys a powerful way of conducting your own research papers that is perhaps a different way of thinking about the topic than perhaps you were necessarily thinking about, right? You obviously you need to end up in a position where you're discussing a topic that is obviously related to animal law, but you can start from a bigger or more generalized issue and drill down if you want to as well. Any other thoughts or reactions to that piece? There's a comment from Kat in the chat. I read these papers on farming practices and wonder if these people, the writers, actually go to facilities and review the actual practices and what impacts their proposed changes will do for farmers economically. Then you have consumers who whine about the costs of same and the farmers are blamed. I found the paper on free range frustrating to read, to be honest. Okay, so speaking as an academic, very often people are not able, especially since COVID, people are not able to go on field work to go on site and to look at this stuff. Sometimes they are able to, and often they are able to, but not always. But yeah, it's an interesting point about the range of perspectives that have to be considered and balanced in this space, and I think that there's a broader lesson for everyone in conducting their research papers. Obviously, as I said, you've got to do something that's feasible within the time constraints and everything else, but making sure that you are doing research that considers a range of viewpoints, or don't just rely on one source as the basis for your own research is perhaps a useful takeaway. Fieldwork activists that get arrested or breach our biosecurity practices by trespassing. Well, I mean, that's certainly one element of it. You would hope that people conducting academic research are, able to do things a bit more openly and ask to meet someone for an interview or something like that. But yeah, this is Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it's good that you guys have the opportunity to look at things from a more broad perspective in this unit, because we kind of in law we do tend to focus on or deal with once the legislation is enacted, and then the consequences of interpreting that and everything else. But there's this whole process before that where the policy is developed, and from that legislation is crafted and all that sort of thing. So thinking about the the prequels, if you will, is something that is really interesting, and potentially, obviously, you need to narrow your focus, but thinking about sort of a policy development research topic that fits within kind of the topics that have been suggested, potentially that's that's a useful avenue to go down as well. Absolutely. And I think your point also, you're very complimentary of the authors, and I think that in doing so you've highlighted the value of research more broadly, but the value of this research task too, because it's designed to give you guys practice in and to hone your research skills, because it is a really valuable skill to have, no matter where you kind of end up. Being able to critically analyze processes and events and things that you read is absolutely, really huge and really important. Any other particular takes on the free range egg debate? Cool. Alrighty. I'll take that as a no, which is cool. I think now is probably a good time to sort of take stock again, and you guys have been really great sort of asking questions as you go along. But has any of this discussion sort of flagged for you guys any? We'll sort of expand back out again to think about the assignment more broadly. Has this raised any other questions or thoughts or ideas that you've had in terms of research in the animal law context, but also thinking about the task that you're going to have to do over the next month or so? Changing topic and focus, perhaps. I suppose the key thing that I would say as well is that obviously this discussion has been fairly general, because it kind of has to apply to potentially anything, but you're more than welcome to get in touch over the next few weeks, and obviously we've got the Christmas break coming up, but I'm not going anywhere, so I'll still be easily contactable via email. Feel free to get in touch and we can talk about your particular topic or research question that you're interested in, and we can think about what you're going to do in a much more targeted sense, because as I said, this is obviously just much more general. Thinking about mind mapping is a really good suggestion as well. So and planning your research in general can be quite useful in a few different stages of the research process, I would suggest. So thinking at the very start, thinking about the topics that you might be interested in, and how you might narrow that down to a clear research question. Mind mapping in that space can be quite useful, because that can help you sort of narrow your topic down, think about what you really want to kind of get at, but then also later in the process, mind mapping how you're actually going to structure your paper. I know Alex has given you a pretty clear suggested structure, but within that there's still plenty of variation. So mind mapping in that sense can be really useful too. Is that sort of, are those the senses that you were meaning, Darren, or did you have something else in mind? No, that's all good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's perfect. So I sort of suggested mind mapping at the very start, and then you know, the very start of the process to begin with, and then at the start of the writing process. But you're sort of talking about the middle bit where you're conducting your research. Absolutely, that can be really useful too, to kind of get a sense of, I suppose, the layout of the literature, who's saying what, how is the debate very one-sided, or does it seem to be evenly split? Yeah, absolutely, all that sort of stuff can be really developed as well. Kat, so I think that's probably best. Your comment, Kat, is probably best dealt with, I suppose, as a, just because it's your individual topic. It's probably better handled as a private conversation, if that's all right. Just because, as an individual research task, it's it's better to deal with these things individually. But yeah, more than happy to talk about your particular topic if you want to at some point. The other thing that we should really address is thinking about the structure of the paper. And as I said, Alex has kind of given a rough structure, which I think you guys should find quite useful. But thinking about the role of the abstract in a research paper is important as well. You'll notice in the examples that you've been given for this week and in other weeks, they come with an abstract. And there's what I would suggest, and this is this is sort of what I was going to talk about, right? In the chat, Shah said I usually write the abstract last. What I would suggest, and it's only a suggestion, you do what works for you. Have a go at writing an abstract first, because you sort of, the way I kind of see it is the first draft of your abstract is like a really, really simple introduction to the paper, right? Because your abstract has got to cover, what you're doing, what your research question is, your method, so how did you find out whatever you wanted to find out, your results, and the significance of your topic. So what do you want to know, how did you find it out, and why should anyone care, basically, are the questions that your abstract should answer. And if you try doing that first, then you've already answered all those questions in your mind. And then when you go through actually writing the paper, you will have already figured out all those things, and things will usually flow a lot better, right? If you're feeling a bit stuck, you can refer back to that abstract and remind yourself, okay, yeah, that's the next thing that I really need to cover. That's the key message that I really want the reader to take away from this, etc. Then once you've written the paper, come back and obviously refine the abstract, because it probably will have changed a little bit along the way. You might have had a brainwave while you were writing, or something else might have become a little bit more prominent as you kind of went through the writing process. So don't just leave the abstract untouched if you wrote it first. But yeah, my suggestion to you would be to write an initial abstract as, I suppose, a guiding piece for your paper, and then write it, and then come back and edit the abstract, and maybe you even write a new abstract completely fresh once you've written the paper. It's up to you, but that's one strategy that you might find really useful in relation to the abstract. Any other thoughts or questions or comments about the research paper? Perfect. Well, as I say, you're more than welcome to get in touch over the next few weeks to workshop your particular topic or question or whatever you're interested in. We've got the break next week, and then we're back. The other, I suppose, bit of housekeeping that's worth noting is that so we're back in week 7 on the 3rd of January, which is the New Year's Eve public holiday. Unfortunately, because of kind of the timetabling and different units and clashes and stuff, we can't really reschedule that that session. So we do kind of have to press forward on the public holiday, unfortunately. But the session will be recorded. I'll have a chat to Alex to actually get Zoom to do the recording itself properly. But if you can't make it because of that public holiday, that's not a problem. This will be recorded. It'll be uploaded as usual. The other bit of housekeeping is in relation to your discussion forum assessment. Obviously, there's been a bit of a disruption with me kind of stepping in very recently, but the marking process is underway, and I'll get those to you as soon as I possibly can. I'm hoping to get those to you before Christmas, but we'll have to see how that goes. I'm not making that promise or guarantee just at this stage, but you can be assured that I'm definitely really pushing to try and get that done before Christmas, because I understand that you guys obviously do want those marks as quickly as possible. Alrighty. Comment from Darren in the chat about using the rubric to signpost as well. Yeah, absolutely. Paying attention to the rubric will give you a really clear indicator as well about kinds of things that we're looking for you to demonstrate, and that can be a really useful way of kind of making sure that your paper covers everything that it needs to cover as well. But yeah, unless there's any other closing comments, we'll call it there. Thanks very much for coming along to this extended session. Great to meet or re-meet you all again. And yeah, have a great Christmas, and we'll see you back in the new year. Alrighty, thanks very much. Bye.